Paul Henry, welcome to Between Two Beers.
Hence the sound of the beer opening.
Yeah.
Normally it's a can, Paul, and
better sound.
but much better sound.
The can has the pop.
Yeah.
The bottle is always disappointing, and I knew it was going to be disappointing, but here we are.
Did it anyway.
So look, Between Two Beers is a bit of a mess this afternoon because it's been over 500 days since Seamus last had a drink.
Correct.
I am representing Export in the Export Beer Garden studio, and Paul, you're on the gins this afternoon, and you've got a new line of gins out.
I have, the Henry. It's an interesting thing. So between two beers, there is only one beer drinker in this room.
Correct.
It's not embarrassing that I'm a gin drinker, but you actually a teetotal now.
Yes, 500 plus days. There you go.
Sitting between two beers for too long will do that too.
It will do. It will do. No, but Stephen's picked up the mantle. He's done well.
Yep. Well, he's drinking twice as much, obviously.
I'm carrying the load.
I love that you've brought your own in.
I know. So I started to make gin. I used to produce wine, Pinot Noir, which I love dearly. But here's the problem with wine, and some people will say it's not a problem. They'll say it's part of the art of it. But the trouble with art is it's not consistent. And so what would happen is I would get the grapes, and you could only get so many from such a vintage, and you would do a blend, and I could only make as much as I could get of the grapes that I used in the blend. So some years I would only make like 2 pallets, and it would sell straight away. And then you couldn't reproduce exactly the same wine again because I was trying to make the best quality wine from Pinot Noir grapes from Central Otago.
I was going to ask if it was all Central Otago.
All Central Otago, all Pinot Noir. It was only about 6 vineyards that I used, and I would buy their grapes. And so the trouble was, it was hard work, but every year you were starting from scratch. The great thing about gin, which I love, is that gin is essentially a chemical compound. And once you've got it right, and once you've got like the botanicals, which I source from all over the world for the watermelon gin,
all over the world.
Yep, it will always be the same. So in terms of consistency, it is always the same. It's always absolute first quality. Triple distilled, premium spirits, 40%. Everything is always the same. So it's not so much art. The art is in tasting it and getting it right in the first place. But in terms of producing it, that's not an art.
I love the fact that you say it's the same. When you've opened this today, you've taken a smell. So presumably every time you open and you smell it, you smell the same thing.
And it just reminds me every time, this is the watermelon gin, and just you smell it and it's like it's a fresh cut watermelon, and it's beautiful gin. The trouble with a lot of flavored gins, and this is best quality gin with watermelon. The trouble with a lot of flavored gins is they use poor quality alcohol and things like that because it's flavored, and people will say, well, why would you use the best quality alcohol if you're then going to put watermelon in it? But that's exactly what I've done. And you can tell because when you taste it, which you can't do because you're teetotal, but when you taste it, it's smooth and rich, which gin should be. If you take, like I drink it neat, if you drink gin neat and it burns, it's probably not great quality alcohol. But 40% there's going to be a little bit of a burn in there with 40%. But anyway,
do you give a shit about how much it sells? Like you've produced this great gin you're very proud of. Do you care how it goes on the shelves?
It's an interesting question. It's more about me making it and being satisfied in making it than worrying about how it sells. So I suppose the answer in a way is no. I mean, I want people to love it, and it's a little bit more expensive. It's at the very low end of premium gin prices. But there are several things I could do to reduce the price of that per bottle considerably, and I'm not prepared to do any of them because it will reduce the quality. Yeah. The reality is, if you're sitting on the beach in summer and you're already half cut, and you open my gin and you open a gin that's half the price, maybe you won't tell a huge difference. I mean, you will if obviously mine's the only watermelon one, but I do a London style, and if you're half cut already, and you know what I mean. Yeah. You might not, but if you're just pouring yourself a lovely glass of gin, you deserve to drink the best. And this is absolutely the best.
Well, fantastic. We're very excited to be here sharing a beer. You're sharing a gin. Sharing some good vibes.
Can I look back to the gin for just a second? Who's responsible for the social media profile of this gin? Because there's some very creative content on there.
It's me.
Is it genuinely? I really wanted to know.
It genuinely is because I know nothing about social media. And a couple of people have said some things to me. But mostly it's just I do things and they'll go surprisingly well, and I'll think that's bizarre that anyone would watch that and think it was a full yarn.
No, it's good.
Because in
stuff.
journalism, you really have to have a story. But on social media, you just need to have a tiny component of a story, I've discovered.
It's good stuff.
Thank you.
So yeah, look,
Particularly, I'm going to harbour this point. Particularly the framing of the photos.
Oh, I've always cared about photos. I was a photojournalist for a while.
Right.
When I was a foreign correspondent. So I've always cared about photos. I'm that sort of person that thinks if you're taking a photo of a person, the person should be the photo, not, where is it? Oh, just behind that hill.
Yeah, the gin's always in the foreground.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
I like it.
So yeah, pleasantly surprised that you're here with us, and there's a slightly humorous story about how it all came about. So your daughter Bella is married to Julian Collett, who is a friend of mine I know from footy circles. So I've reached out to him inquiring if he thought you might be keen to come on our podcast, and I've actually written down his response. This is on Facebook Messenger. He says, "Off the bat, I would say not a chance in hell, but I would love to see it happen, so send it to me and I'll try weasel my way in." And to his credit, Julian has delivered. So he put me in contact with Bella, and she came back to me and said he's keen. Once he heard John Key had been on, it legitimised it for him. Only John Key hasn't been on our show. So in an email, I'd said that Sir JK had been a former guest trying to sort of prop us up. That was John Kerwin. So I was like,
See, isn't that the problem with knighthoods?
yeah, Sir JK.
So confusing.
And initials.
So I'm comfortable enough telling that story, thinking you're here now. It's,
too far in
it's
now.
unlikely that you're going to pull pin. But the beauty of having Julian in our camp is he's given us a few little nuggets of fun to start with.
Nice.
And
nice.
The first one I think is tinged with a little bit of passag. And so he said, well, you could ask him about his beautiful big boat. It has my fishing rod on it, but I still haven't been allowed to go fishing off it yet.
To be fair, I never asked him to leave his fishing rod on my beautiful big boat. But he did, and I have a collection of fishing rods on the boat, but I don't like people fishing on the boat because it is, to quote Julian, beautiful.
Yeah.
And there is nothing beautiful about dealing with a panicked sea creature that is thrashing around in the last moments of its life.
Yeah.
And then someone will always say, "Oh my God, that's a keeper," and they'll start slicing it to pieces on the deck. And they smell, I don't know if you've noticed, like fish.
I thought you were talking about Julian.
So yes, I have his rod, and sometimes I let people fish to catch things to throw them back, but they're only allowed to stand right at the back.
Yeah.
Never let Julian do that.
I've been fishing with Julian, so I can understand you not
He
letting
looks
him
like
on.
someone who would want to keep everything, no matter how big or small.
Yeah, we'll get a pic of Julian on our socials so people know who we're talking about.
Snorted.
Okay, and so the second one he's sent through.
There we go.
So did I.
It's passing on.
So a common thread we've heard is a theme of hoarding, and Julian has sent through two examples. So the first picture was a plastic bottle of some Middle Eastern beverage that had the expiry date 12/06/06. Do you know what this one is?
And what point are you trying to make?
You're still going with that one?
I mean, seriously, do you worry about expiry dates?
I guess it depends on the
It's
beverage.
this century, for God's sake. Is it? Yes, of course
Yeah,
it is.
yeah,
Of course it's this century. So did he send you a photo of this
He
beverage?
did send me a photo of the beverage.
Orange.
Okay.
It's an orange liquid.
Yeah.
I don't think,
well,
I don't
it's
think it's
a
in the
Fanta.
gin range.
It's Fanta.
Okay.
It's Fanta.
Well, that'll keep.
And if you spoke a foreign language, you'd know it was Fanta.
Yeah, true.
No, so it's not the liquid it's not like I'm keeping it for a rainy day in case I get really thirsty. We're down to that 2006 bottle. I was being chased out of a country under fear of my life, and I purchased that at the airport before I got on this shonky Sudanese plane to fly to Egypt from... what's the name of the place in Sudan, the capital of Sudan? It's a great name. We've got to think of it.
Kinshasa?
No. Damn it. No, that was good.
Good
but
guess.
You're in a different country. Kinshasa is, what's the name? But it is K, isn't it?
I think so. That's why I've kind of gone with it.
It is K because,
And
of
I'm
course,
a daily Wordle player as well. So I should,
well,
I should get this.
their most famous inhabitant was Osama bin Laden. What is Khartoum.
Nice.
Khartoum.
Producer
Adam coming in 2023.
Producer from the back of the room.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
All the money's over here, but the brains are over there.
Very, very much so. You figured that early. Very early.
Yeah, Khartoum. So I was being chased out of Khartoum because I'd been doing some filming, and it was unwise filming, and it was an absolute shithole, and very dangerous. And I thought, how bizarre! I'll race through this airport to get onto my Sudanese flight, and I'll quickly grab a bottle of pop on the way because there'll be no drink on the plane. But as it happens, I didn't drink it on the plane, but now I'm being victimised over having kept it for so many years.
Can I make an observation?
Yes.
Please.
Fanta is an interesting choice to grab on your way through. Are you a Fanta guy?
I'm not, but they didn't have Coca-Cola.
Right.
Perhaps for some Arab reason, I don't know, although they're quite big on Coca-Cola. And what you know is, any of those drinks are essentially, sugar introduced to a tiny amount of moisture. And so they're going to be, they're going to sustain you.
I would have even gone a Sprite above a Fanta, if I'm being honest.
No, I don't know if you would.
Really?
Yeah.
You're questioning my
Well, what
my
I'm
own
saying
choice?
is putting you in the same situation.
Yeah.
Chase you with a few guns to an airport.
Yeah,
There's
okay.
one flight leaving.
All
It's
right.
the only one.
Yep.
You've got a Sprite and you've got a Fanta.
Orange attracts the attention.
See what
doesn't
I'm
it?
saying?
Yeah. And you put me right in your shoes.
I did. Funny story, actually. So I'm in Khartoum. This was a few days earlier. And I had a driver that was taking me into the middle of nowhere. Now, you might think Khartoum is the middle of nowhere, but Khartoum is the beginning of the middle of nowhere. You have to go through Khartoum to get to the middle of nowhere. Anyway, this driver says big old four-wheel drive truck. And we were just talking, and I said, God, this road is a piece of shit, isn't it? He said, oh, this road was fantastic when it was built. He said, I tell you who built this road. Osama bin Laden built the road, because, of course, that was his family. They were a construction family. They were road builders. And I said, oh, my God, did he actually work on it? Or was his father just... No. He worked on this. This was one of their projects, this road through Sudan. He said, actually, we lived next door to Osama bin Laden. And I said, oh, what was he like? He said, kept himself to himself, but there was this one evening where they were having a wedding at Osama bin Laden's house. And he said, we had quite a big family, living right next door. And they were almost terraced houses, if you can imagine, in Khartoum. And he said there was just a hell of a lot of noise. And he said, we'd never heard from these people, and it was getting later and later. He said, I was a little boy, and my sister was younger, and my dad goes next door, and he said, I can remember standing on the doorstep. My dad goes next door, hammers on Osama bin Laden's door. This guy that they'd never met before, because he kept himself to himself, comes to the door. Turns out it was Osama bin Laden. And his dad said, look, this is beyond a joke. He said this in Arabic. He said, look, and I'm putting words in his mouth, but this is roughly what he said. He said, look, this is beyond a joke. It's bloomin', whatever the time was. And I've got young kids here. Look, they're just standing in the doorway there. They can't get to sleep. And apparently the only words that Osama bin Laden ever said to this guy's father, and the only words he ever heard him say, were, I will put it right immediately.
Oof, wow.
In his language.
Yeah.
And before the father got round the gate to the door, could have heard a pin drop.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's authority.
And it's an incredible insight into the start of this podcast that we've gone from Julian Collett to Osama bin Laden in less than 10 minutes.
And when you're a father of 3 daughters, every single boy they bring home is Osama bin Laden to start with. Yeah.
And if you put it right.
Yeah. Well, actually, Julian has put it right to a degree, but I'm still watching him out of one eye.
Yeah.
Just to close the loop on Julian and to finish off the hoarding section, he's also sent. Oh, there's quite a good story about the Fanta, and I'm happy with where that went. He also sent through 2 photos of what he describes as broken vacuum cleaners. Look to me like sort of 1990s model, and they're sort of just there in the house.
Where?
I don't know where.
Well,
exactly.
you've seen the photos.
I don't know what your house.
But are
looks
they in the garage?
Perhaps.
Which is where most people who are not hoarders would keep broken vacuum cleaners.
Why would you keep a broken vacuum cleaner?
Well, because it's in the garage. It's on its way to either
sections
being repaired, because it would be churlish just to throw it out straight away, because when something's broken, how broken is it? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Flexible. Things can always be fixed.
Things can always be fixed. And the instant you throw that broken vacuum cleaner out, someone knocks on the door and says, I've got half a good vacuum cleaner here. You
Do this?
you would, no, that must have happened to you. I've got half a good vacuum cleaner here. Is there any chance you'd have half a good vacuum cleaner in your... And and how many times have people said to you, I threw one out just the other day.
Yeah. Not many.
So I just don't throw it out.
Yeah.
Are these photos taken from what's I've heard colloquially has been known as the dumping house?
Do I have a dumping house?
I don't know. Do you have a dumping house?
Well, I've dumped Julian in a house, which clearly he's not quite as grateful for as I would have liked.
Maybe you should have let him go fishing.
Yes, maybe I should have let him go fishing.
I think Julian might regret giving us some nuggets on this one.
I guess I'll be moving out tomorrow.
Let's move past the Julian Collett section. So, look, upon our research, we often have guests that have lived quite remarkable lives on this podcast, but I'm not sure many, if any, can touch yours. And our research has suggested that you've had the following jobs: international news correspondent in Iraq, cable boy and gopher at the BBC, projectionist in the Natural History Unit, breakfast radio host in the Wairarapa. You set up your own radio station, Today FM, and sold it. Ran as National Party candidate for Wairarapa. Protested at...
I thought you were going to get it. he was practicing.
Have you practiced this one?
We were practicing this on the drive. Yeah.
Mururoa.
Nice.
I keep wanting to say Mururoa.
Which is, at the end of the day, the language is all about communication. And we get a bit too prissy on pronunciation. We really do.
Yeah.
And do you know what you hear? You hear people... I heard someone the other day on television bemoaning the poor pronunciation of Māori in this country. And she said, you should just listen to their pronunciation. And I thought, if you can't pronounce pronunciation, get off my television screen.
Houses, stones.
If you're actually here complaining about poor pronunciation, you can't pronounce the word. But I think we get a bit prissy about it.
Mururoa. Good. Ran an antique shop and a cafe. Sold Lexington encyclopedias. Best-selling author, 3 books. And, of course, one of New Zealand's most successful and popular broadcasters, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
And gin.
And... a gin and winemaker.
Those weren't chronological, by the way.
What have I missed?
All over the place. It has been dancing around those things that you've mentioned. It has been, to quote that lovely line from Love Actually, it has been a wonderful life. The little things like I've been in plane crashes and I've been in shipwrecks, but just little plane crashes and little shipwrecks because I'm here. But when I start thinking about things and my mind's jogged on things, it has been extraordinary. I've put myself, and I've only got myself to credit for it because I allowed myself to be put in those positions. So, a lot of my experiences have come down to luck, but you have to put yourself in the position where you can have that kind of luck, It's much easier just to follow the line of least resistance, which is what most people do because, life can be hard and people, it's easier just to do the thing you've been doing rather than just call it quits and do something else. Luckily, I've been spectacularly fired on multiple occasions.
Which we'll get to.
But the thing is, every single time the decision for my employment to stop has been made for me, I have ended up in a far better position than had I stayed, And I believe that you can just be... And I look at... I won't name names, but there are people who have not been fired at times when I've been fired, who look back ages later and feel sorry for me that I was, fired and they weren't. And I look at them and I think, no, and here we are 10 years later, and you were doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same building with exactly the same people, and yet you're trying to feign success, as a result of that. I think a rich tapestry of life is that, to be broad of vision and have a rich tapestry of life, that's success, I think.
You're my favourite type of guest because you've led such a colourful life and you're such a good storyteller. So there's a bunch of little bits and pieces we kind of want to jump around it. And the first one that jumped out is I would love you to tell in as much or as little detail as possible about the time you were detained in Iraq. I'm not sure if you were imprisoned or detained or the sort of backstory about what happened there.
But I was detained in it was a cell, but it was I suppose you would call it a immigration cell. It was in the middle of the desert. So basically the situation was I was a freelance foreign correspondent. I had a few contracts, one with Radio Pacific in New Zealand, and I had one with the Independent in London and with 2UE in Sydney. And I would try and take photos. This is when I was a photojournalist as well. When I say photojournalist as well, I would do everything I could to make money out of the expensive situations I was putting myself in. So I tried to do everything. And this was just before the internet was popular, just before it was feasible. So I had, a big satellite phone, which was the size of a small suitcase, and, a normal camera with Kodak film and what have you. And anyway, on this occasion, so I'd gone to, and I pause a lot because I'm a very old man now. I'd gone to that Arab country, which is very friendly.
Kuwait?
No, that's not that friendly.
I'm just trying to think of the same.
You just name an Arab country.
Yeah, well, I was in the right. I
You
was
weren't
in the
thinking
right
friendly,
area.
yeah. He was just thinking Arab country,
Yeah.
wasn't he? No,
I was thinking somewhere close proximity.
Yeah, well, it's not immediately next to Kuwait, but you've got
The UAE.
Iran, yeah,
Adam.
but then you've got what's the name in Jordan, for God's sake.
Oh.
How could we not instantly think of Jordan?
I was thinking of Amman, but I couldn't think of the country.
Interviewed the king of Jordan. I mean, I got this was the extraordinary thing. I would put myself in positions, and because I was one journalist on a New Zealand passport, I would get into the most extraordinary situations. And so I would be interviewing the King of Jordan. And during the Commonwealth Games in Malaysia, I don't know if you remember this, but the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Datuk Sri Mohammed, he imprisoned his deputy for sodomy. And I thought, as the world media did, one, that's a little bit extraordinary. Apparently there was an issue with a corporate cab driver or something. But one, I thought that's a little bit extraordinary. But two, I thought it's more extraordinary that you would do that in that one small window when the Commonwealth Games were on. So the world's media is here today, and you've decided today to imprison your deputy for sodomy.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the actual act of sodomy during that little window that the Commonwealth Games was on.
No, because I think he had been sodomizing people for quite some time. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you're
With a sober person?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway.
I'm really dialed in on it.
Yeah, I can see. Well, if you're not drinking alcohol,
You gotta.
where am I going with that?
Yeah.
Anyway, so there's this huge press conference, and I'd been ingratiating myself at the I was going to say the palace, but it was like a palace there because Mohammed had been prime minister for so many years and was basically anyway. It doesn't matter. So there's this huge press conference, and at the end of the Mahathir Mohammed comes in, and he's wearing his like almost communist uniform with Mahathir on it, in case you didn't notice the Prime Minister. And he makes a statement, and then he walks off the stage, and the world's media, I mean, literally the New York Times, well, I mean, everyone, CNN, New York Times, everyone was there. He walks off stage, and this press secretary or whoever comes to the microphone and makes the hand signals, for everyone to calm down. And he says, no more statements will be made. I will just get Paul Henry, independent from New Zealand, and whatever the person's name was from the New York Times to wait behind for a one-on-one with the Prime Minister. But the rest of you will need to leave now. Wow. And I mean, you think, God, and then you think, shit, I haven't got any questions. I'm going to have to make the most of this, And so because of the way I traveled, I didn't have a crew or anything because I couldn't afford it. I would very often be in situations like that. Funnily enough, I said to him, when, I was in this room with these huge, like cinema curtains, in the old days, like at the Civic, the cinema curtains were velvet and that. This room was just velvet curtains everywhere and big oil paintings of Mahathir. And he comes over and shakes my hand and then sits down on this couch. So I sit down next to him. I've got my little DAT recorder and what have you. And the best question I could think of was to say, no matter how bad this guy was, no matter how concerned you were about him, could it not have waited for a couple of weeks? Why would you besmirch the Commonwealth Games for this? And he said to me, look at me, Mr. Henry. I am a very old man. I care more about this country than any other thing. I do not want to risk it falling into the filthy hands of a sodomist. Hard to argue with that.
Mm. Yeah. Some soundbite.
It was a great sound. Even when I say it like that, it's a great soundbite. Yeah.
So how did that lead to you getting detained?
Oh, it didn't. That was a different thing altogether. No, what I've done, this has turned into a two Ronnies sketch. No, so what happened there basically is I'm there, every day I go down to the Iraqi embassy in Jordan, waiting for Mr. I think his name was yes, it was. Most names I forget, but his name was Mr. Sadoun. And the way they used to say it was, Sadoun. You'll have to wait for Mr. Sadoun. Most days Mr. Sadoun didn't come, but he was the only one that could stamp the authorizations for journalists to go into Iraq. There was a war on, but there was still a queue of journalists. And Peter Arnett and umpteen different people were, famous people as well as umpteen people like me were there trying to get in. Anyway, every day we would turn up, every day, some reason. And then every now and then Mr. Sadoun would come in his Lexus and drive down past the building, and everyone would get excited. But it was just, basically it came down to how much can you pay. And they wanted like 10,000 US, and it was all going in their back pockets, 10,000 US just to get a satellite phone into the country. So you can imagine how much the entire bill would cost. And there was a Finnish journalist, and every day, in the end, you just ended up talking to the other journalists. You can't spend an entire war in Jordan, although some people did.
So, I think a lot of people would.
Well, the refugees did. Yeah. Lucky them. Anyway, this Finnish journalist, in the end, he said to me, we're never going to get into Iraq, I'm going to have to go back. And I said, there's just a road. And what would happen, this road went into the desert, huge road into the desert. And at night, it was lit up like a Christmas tree with the oil tankers, because, of course, there were so many restrictions on Iraq. And they were literally empty oil tankers going in, full oil tankers coming out. But there were so many of them, this huge road. And it was like a 24, 25-hour drive. And the road was just consistent all day, all night with oil tankers. I said, well, why don't we just give it a go? Why don't we just hire a four-wheel drive and we'll just drive in? There's a war on, for God's sake. Surely, how hard can it be? And we'll just plead. This is the New Zealander in me, just that whole thing. I had no idea, which is not a defense in any country. To not know the law is not a defense, but you can usually use it. Anyway, he stupidly agreed with me, and we went out and we found this driver in this big old truck, and we just drove to Iraq. And when we got close, we discovered, and it was about 2:00 in the morning, there was lots of searchlights on a checkpoint and everything. And I said, and this is where the story starts to come apart, I said, it's just desert. Why don't we scoot? I know, see? Now, if you'd been with me, just hearing you say, like that, if you'd been with me, you would have sorted me out. Yeah. And you would have said, as this Finnish guy should have said, that is a ludicrous idea. Yeah. Anyway, he didn't say that. He said, yeah, give it a go. I said, why don't we just scoot around the outside? When it was daylight, it's as flat as anything. It's the desert, for Christ's sake. Just scoot around the outside and just come in a bit later. And then just drive into Baghdad. So that was the extent of my plan. So we drove into the desert. It was a lot less smooth than I thought. The actual, it's like because I do a lot of boating, and it's like the sea. You look at from a distance and you think, it's quite calm. When you actually get down there on the water, it can sometimes not be. And the desert was not as smooth as I thought, and the going was a little bit tough. And I had originally thought, because it was smooth and we ballpark knew, because you can see the road because of the lights of the trucks. So we ballpark. I thought we could do it without lights on the truck.
I was going to ask,
it was an important part of my plan.
Flick the lights off.
Well, that was an important part of my plan. But because it was a lot rougher than I thought, it became necessary to have the lights on the truck, which signals your presence. Anyway, it turns out, cut a long story short, and this is a long story. Cut a long story short, it's a desert, it's Iraq, there's a war on, and it's freezing cold, as it often is at night in the desert. And we drove into a military base.
That'll do it.
And it did.
That'll do it, yeah.
It did. So we were both beaten quite badly. The Finnish guy...
I've heard you say this, and you say it quite nonchalantly. But
well, because I think we could so easily have been killed.
Right.
So it would have been easier to kill us than not, because if you don't kill the person, there's paperwork. And And he said to me, when it became obvious, where basically the truck grinds to a halt, and there are just these guys with substantial-looking, aged weapons pointing at you. And that's disconcerting in itself. And he said, well, this is unacceptable. Finnish people can be a bit like that. I don't know if you know Finnish people, but they can be a little bit sticklers just sticklers for the law and things like that. And he started talking about the Geneva Convention. I said, look, if I can impart one bit of wisdom from someone who's never read the Geneva Convention, if I can impart one bit of wisdom, I don't imagine the Geneva Convention is worth shit in this situation.
Yeah.
So I think I would not mention the Geneva Convention. I said, what we need to do is go back to my original plan, which is just plead insanity, like, I'm so sorry. We're just here to tell the Iraqi story from the point of view of Iraqis. That sort of ingratiating thing. Anyway, he went with the Geneva Convention thing and was beaten within inches of his life. I was beaten into submission, and I submit very, very quickly.
I imagine most people would under duress.
And why would you not?
Yeah.
There are no points to be scored. There's no moral high ground in the middle of the desert in winter. Actually, that's a good line.
Write that down.
Someone should write that down. There's no moral high ground in the middle of the desert in winter.
We'll clip that soundbite. And
Could you?
Yeah.
If you could.
How does Paul Henry, you're such a confident, outgoing guy. You're talking about your mate getting beaten within inches of his life.
He wasn't my mate,
No,
really.
he's not friends.
Well, your colleague, whoever you were with, you were getting beaten
Just a
as
guy.
well. What's your mind, what's your thoughts at that stage? Are you shitting your pants?
Yeah, you're shitting yourself.
Yeah.
Because you know how bad it can be. And I was in a situation like this as well in the Cambodian jungle when the war was on there. And you know that the easiest thing to do is to kill you. And this sounds, to people listening to this, they might think, oh, what is this bullshit? But honestly, when I talk about paperwork, if you are alive, you are a problem. And in these situations, if you're dead, you were never there, And so I knew how bad it could be. And you've got to ingratiate yourself. You've got to try and make them believe that you're likable and you're sorry. And God, I was just giving it a go like you guys would if you were on my side.
Did anyone back in Jordan, had you left a note? Do
you know the funny thing? I actually got into almost more trouble getting back into, because I was put into a cell in the desert and it was very uncomfortable, very unpleasant. But I gradually got on the right side of these people, my captors, and the guy who was running the station where I was. And in the end, he let me go. He didn't let the Finnish guy. I don't know what happened to the Finnish guy. And the worst thing for me is I don't know what happened to our driver. But I mean, he was paid, but I do worry a little bit about that. No, worry? No. But I think a bit about it. I got him into trouble, basically, and I didn't see him leave. Anyway, they let me get in a truck to go. But when I got to the checkpoint, which I'd never been to before because we went through the desert, all of a sudden I'm arriving in Jordan, but I'd never left. And they liked their paperwork, and they had on paper that I was in Jordan already. So how could I be arriving at the border? Where have I been? Where have I been for the past 4 or 5 days?
I wanted to know the duration of that. So it was
4 or 5 days. I can't remember exactly now. It was about 5 days. Yeah. And that was really problematic because these people weren't going to beat me to death. They were probably going to throw me in prison, in a legitimate prison in Jordan, because clearly I'd done something illegal, which I had done. So,
We're just painting a picture here, Paul. Like, in my notes, all right, I've got a paragraph here. Detained in Iraq was one of them. Shot at in Cambodia. Nearly lynched in the slums of Calcutta. Threatened by the French Navy and shelled in Bosnia. Like, is this just one? Is that
that's
the most intense
many different
story?
issues?
That's many different issues. But is that just one example? Are all of them sort of similar? We
They're
don't have time
similar
to go into
things.
all of them. But
if you put yourself into these situations, then those sort of things are going to happen. And when you read them as a list, you think, oh, it can that have happened to one person? But this is over a period of years. And if you're constantly putting yourself in that situation, which you do when you're, I only survived, like Bella, my youngest daughter who's sitting over here now, and her 2 sisters, only had food to eat because I sold a few photos and a few stories. And we lived in a big mansion outside Masterton, and it had to be paid for, it had to be funded. The only way I could do that was by making as much as possible from conflicts and locations that cost me a fortune to get to. And so I put myself in those sort of positions.
And when these things happen, did you have reflections on them? Like, is this the right path to be continuing on?
Absolutely, 100%. I was walking down a track once in Cambodia, and this was the Ieng Sari, who was Pol Pot's number 2. So Pol Pot was still alive at the time, but he was, essentially in self-imprisonment in the middle of the country, and you just no one at this point, no Western journalist had ever been in to interview him and get out alive. It's a one-way track. But Ieng Sari, who was trying to gain some legitimacy politically, he had a private army of 6,000 people in Pai Lin, which is on the Laos border with Cambodia. And so I'd gone there to interview him because he was seeking a bit of legitimacy. But he was an evil warlord and responsible for the massacre of how many thousands of innocent people. It's hard to say, although the Khmer Rouge chronicled a lot of them. Of course, that story, everyone knows that story. So I'm walking down this track, and what was your question?
Is reflection.
Yeah.
Reflecting on how dangerous your life was.
Yeah.
And
yes, I know. Yeah, that's right. So I'm driving actually down this track. Now, the thing in Cambodia is that the whole place is landmined. And while I was there at this time, you both saw the world there lifting landmines out of areas, and at the same time, what was left of the Khmer Rouge was still putting new landmines in. But they were putting new landmines in the areas that had been marked as free of landmines. So you don't actually need many landmines anymore, because the UN or whoever goes there and removes all the landmines, Princess Diana and her business were removing all these landmines, and then the Khmer Rouge were going in and sticking a landmine in the middle of the area. Anyway, so we're driving down this track and passing these refugees that were leaving a small town, I can't remember the name of it, that had been taken over in this last hurrah for fractions of the Khmer Rouge. And this Jeep came up the track, and you stay exactly on tracks. Like if animals have walked through the bush, you walk in their footsteps because there are no landmines in their footsteps. So when you're going down the track and two vehicles meet, who's going to sidle around? Because obviously most of the landmines are immediately next to the track. Anyway, this Time journalist who I'd met at the Foreign Correspondent Club in Phnom Penh, a little while earlier, he said, "Where the hell are you going?" I said, "I'm just going to go down to the village." And he said, "You'll never get out." And he said to me, this was many, many years ago, he said, "Here's the trick. The further down your road you go, the better the story gets, but the less the chance of being able to tell it." So he said, "You can turn around now and definitely tell your story." He said, "Someone who goes a bit further, if they get out, will have a better story than yours." So how far down the road are you prepared to go?
Did that excite you?
And it does. And people say you must be brave. There was no bravery in it. There's a combination of excitement, adventure, and stupidity. I mean, it's harsh to say there's no bravery, but it really isn't brave. I mean, arguably the entire thing is stupid, doing it. But you answer people who say, "Well, that's ridiculous. Why do you do that?" by saying, "These are stories that have to be told."
How far did you go?
I went a few more corners down. And then do you know what happened? I went around a corner, and you can tell, I don't know what it is, but you can tell when the story is closing in on you. And I went around this following corner, and there was a small clearing, and it was full of refugees, and there was this old woman there. And I said to my driver, it was a small, like a Datsun pickup truck. I said to my driver, and he was absolutely shitting himself. And he was saying in broken English, "We have to turn around, and we can only turn around at a place like this. This could be our last chance to turn around." And there was this really old woman with a sack. Anyway, long story short, I said, "Go and tell these people that we're just going to go down the road a bit further, and when we come back, they can all climb on the back of the truck and we'll get them out." And he went over to tell them, and I got out of the truck and walked over and this woman couldn't speak English. And I called him over as he was coming back, and I said, can you tell this woman, make sure she knows." She was very old. She looked 1,000,000 years old. I said, "Can you tell her so-and-so, what she got in the sack?" And it was her husband. She had picked up what was left of her husband and stuffed his body parts in the sack and was trying to carry him away from a war. So we turned around there and loaded. We got on the back of this little Nissan, And we probably saved all of their lives because the whole place was shelled within half an hour of us pulling out. But we would have got, I want to say 20, 25 people on the back of this little pickup. A lot of them were little kids. And so, I mean, that was a horrible thing to say. A great story. Was a great story. And I use the story of the woman with her husband in the sack and all of that to paint a picture. But, there's an element of, stupidity about that.
Incredible.
About doing it,
Incredible stories. And I'm going to, like I said, we're going to jump around a little bit. And you mentioned before Mansion and Masterton. And I want to kind of link that back to the beginning of, because you came from nothing, right? You came from poverty. And can you tell us about Jesus Boots and moving to, was it Bristol when you were 11?
Yeah.
And
so my parents separated. And they had come to, my mother and father had come to New Zealand. My mother came over on the Osama. My father came over in a Bedford van. He was a bit of an adventurer, gypsy. He was half gypsy, that's a lot of gypsy. So I'm quarter gypsy, which is still a lot of, to be that gypsy is quite a lot in the great scheme of things. In fact, if you're 1/8 gypsy, if you can prove 1/8 gypsy blood, you are considered to be a full gypsy because there are so few. And of course, there was a genocide on them in Europe years and years ago. Anyway, that cut down the numbers. So my father came over in a Bedford van. He advertised for 5 other people to go to New Zealand, come to New Zealand, discover a new life. This was from Bristol in England. And we're going to go in a Bedford van. I've got this great photo, which was in the newspaper. This black and white photo of this Bedford van, and he had a sign painted, overland to New Zealand, and the 5 of them were there. And in the great adventurer's spirit, only 2 of them made it alive. The others died in different ways in the trip, because it was quite a tough thing to do. And so when my parents separated, my mother took me back to Bristol, which was a weird move because she didn't really have anyone there, and she'd been much poorer. Her family was much poorer than hers. She didn't have parents, brought up by her aunt or something. So we went back there and we qualified immediately for a council flat, in a tenement block, because that's how poor we were. I couldn't afford, my mother couldn't afford proper clothing for me, so I had these sandals that I used to wear at school in New Zealand, which were entirely impractical for Bristol in the middle of winter. So every day I'd go to, and I was tormented by the other children. That's what they called me, Jesus Boots. Here's Jesus Boots. They go, oh, here he comes, trudging through the snow in his Jesus Boots, The funny thing is, they say that those sort of things, you grow stronger as a result of them. And it got to the point where these bloody sandals were falling apart. And my mother was working treble shifts in a plastic bag factory, and she said, I can afford to buy you a pair of shoes. And I said to her, you can't buy me shoes. Yeah. They'll all say, oh, Jesus Boots has bought shoes. I said, you've got to go out, and no matter how hard it is, you've got to find me another pair of these bloody sandals in winter in Bristol. So I had to go out. So I spent my entire life at school in Bristol with sandals.
Yeah.
Yeah. Character building.
But I'm interested in charting the path, because I've heard you say, poverty might even be an understatement, like the absolute bones of your ass.
Yeah, we were really poor.
But you've created this fantastic life, and you've reached all these incredible milestones and goals. So how did it happen? Did you get a great education? Did you just have a great brain? Was it your mum? Was it your dad?
No, I think I had vision. I was broad of vision. And I was partly because of my upbringing in New Zealand, which very much in those days, you would look at 10 families and you wouldn't really know how much they had, and they were doing interesting things, and they had boats and that, and all of a sudden you're transplanted into absolute poverty in a tenement block in industrial Bristol, where if you are really, really lucky, when you leave school, you'll be signed up to the pension plan at Imperial Tobacco. And that's it. That's literally, that is your life, mapped out for you by Imperial Tobacco. And like I say, those people, there was no vision. If the really rich people in my class, maybe once every 2 years, went to Spain for holiday, but those were you dreamt of having that kind of money. But I'd seen another world, and my father was an adventurer and had these extraordinary stories. And I think that's all it was. I was just so determined that I would not be signed up to the pension plan at Imperial Tobacco. And I would tell all these stories, lies, most of them, or significant exaggerations about my dad and what we were going to do and what I was going to do and how we had this mansion in New Zealand. And, because I was living, it was a disastrous life, but in my mind, I'd half checked out of that life. We had, I remember once coming home, and my mother was never at home, literally treble shifts in this hideous plastic bag factory. So she only had a few hours at home. So I came back and there were police officers there and the house was taped up. And someone had broken it, as often happens, broken in and stolen the gas and electricity money. So you had meters in the tenement, and you'd put like 20 new pence in for gas, 20 new pence in for electricity, and just the lights would go out. And, someone would shuffle around to see if there were enough coins to put in to get more electricity. Anyway, people would break in and they would break the seals that the companies would put on the machines, because what you'd do, obviously, you'd fake that there was a break-in and get all the money out. And so they put these seals in. If the seals were broken, it didn't, sorry, the seal's broken, this is how much you owe us. And so these people had come in and taken all our coins. And my mother literally, that was 2 weeks' work just to repay the gas and the electricity company for the coins. So it was tough.
How do you reflect? I've heard you talk about and write about your mother, Olive, and basically how she lived for you and helped create this life that you've had. Reflecting now back on everything she did for you, can you talk to us a little bit about how important she was in your journey?
She was interesting because everything was a challenge to her. Her life technically was very, very small. Her mind was very, very small. She was, in many ways, hugely incapable. She was very threatened by authority. If she wouldn't like speaking to people she didn't know, but if she found out someone she was talking to was a doctor, she wouldn't be able to continue speaking. She was, and to be fair, in that generation, people were more threatened than they are now. I mean, but for someone who was frightened of everything, she taught me not to be frightened of anything. For someone whose options were so small and so framed, so hemmed in, she told me there were no options on my life. You can mix with anyone you want. You're as good as anyone you meet. So really, I owe everything to her. And in the backdrop, I knew that my father was an explorer, and his stories, whenever I heard them, and my parents separated, so I hardly ever saw him, but they were extraordinary stories that I then blew out of all proportion and made yet more extraordinary. So I had that from him, and from my mother I had this vision of how small life can be, but this promise that I could do anything at all. So she gave me a license to do anything.
Is it true, the story that your dad threw you in the ocean or the water at age of 5 and said, learn how to swim?
He came home, and I even remember, even though it was a long time ago, it's funny the memories you have, from very young. The first thing I remember is going to Auckland Hospital because I had an abscess on my throat, and I think I was about 4, and I remember specifically some aspects of that. The second thing I remember, I was 5, and I remember my father coming home. My parents used to argue a lot, which is probably why they separated. And there was this fight because he had just discovered that I couldn't swim. And, what was the point of sending him to school if he can't swim? He's 5 years old. How is it possible? We live right next to the ocean. It's just bloody irresponsible that he can't swim. And he said to me, put your togs on, we're going swimming. And so I just thought, this is exciting. We'll go down the bush to the ocean. Dad's going to teach me how to swim. So we go there, and I remember him tightly holding my hands, and we were on this rock, and the tide was in, and it was just rock, ocean. So it wasn't a beach, it was rock, ocean. I know exactly the spot. And I remember him crouching down. He very rarely would talk to me at my level. He crouched down, he looked me right in the eye, and he said, just know this, if you die, your body will float. It's true. People that drown, their bodies float. So why don't they just not bloody drown? If you just remember this, if you die, your body will float. And with that, he picked me up in his arms and he threw me out into the ocean. And the funny thing is, because he threw me, I sort of trusted him. And so I was inhaling a lot of water, and there was and I remember looking at him on this rock, there was not one indication, not the slightest indication that he was concerned or that he would get in the water whether I died or not. And after like a moment of struggling and not screaming, but, spluttering. He said, you see, you're swimming. He said, now all you have to do, no, he said, you see, you're floating. Now all you have to do is get back here. And when you get back here, you won't be a floater, you'll be a swimmer. Oh my God. And I got back. And I got out of the water. He helped me out of the water and he said, son, you can swim. Do it again. And he threw me back in. And the second time I did it in half the time. And when I went up, I remember going into my mother, going into the kitchen and saying to my mother, Dad's taught me how to swim. I can swim now.
How do you reflect on, as a parent, you've got 3 kids of your own. What do you think of that? Do you think that was a good parenting, good teaching method? Was it
worked. Yeah, it was. Well, it was very effective. I mean, I suppose you have to have trust in someone to do that. And I assume if I'd slipped under the surface, he would have jumped in. At the time, it was evident to me that he wouldn't, but I assume he would have. Of course he would have.
Would he? In a weird way, is that where your love of the ocean started? That sense of satisfaction of being taught to swim by?
Always loved it. I mean, he was a marine engineer, and we were always mucking around boats. We were always talking about buying a boat, and there were always adventures to be had. He was always biting off more than he can chew with things, and inventing things. In those days, New Zealand was full of inventors. Every second person down every street was an inventor, and because New Zealand was still being built, whereas now it's just being moaned about. Now every second person down the street is looking for someone to give them a handout. In those days, every second person down the street was building another street. So he was that kind of person. So life was exciting, and we were forging ahead. He worked for a while on the satellite station up north. What's it called? On the way to Wellsford.
I've got every name wrong so far. So
yeah, you have.
I'm not going to.
Khartoum. Anyway, it's just before you get to Wellsford. He's looking it up. He's looking it up on his machine.
No, he's playing Wordle.
Oh, is he? Oh, okay. Anyway, he worked up there for a while. I remember he took me up to work one day, and there was all of this shite. And he said, what you want to do is you want to start a fire and burn some of that rubbish. Anyway, and I can't remember. I was younger than 10. And it was just in Aladdin's cave. So he threw me a box of matches and he said, you want to burn some of this rubbish? It's all bloody rubbish. I'm building a satellite station. So he went down, started to build this satellite station, or, it was under construction. And I started this fire and there were lots of people in suits who started arriving. This fire was huge. Like, it was the size of 2 houses. And I just was dragging stuff over, but it was highly flammable and there was a lot of material around there. This fire got bigger and bigger and bigger. And in the end, they had to call the fire brigade in to hand. It was just massive. And I was no longer needing to drag stuff over to put on the fire. The fire was going for it. And my father was just so proud.
I'm super close to my mum.
Yep.
And I really admire the relationship that you had with Olive. And I love that you continue to carry her with you now with a boat by the same name, and I understand the ashes are also overlooking the bow. Is that right?
The ashes are in the boat. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
How important was that to you to continue that legacy, to carry her with you on one of your great passions, the ocean?
Yeah, it was important. I mean, very, very late in the piece, when she was, semi-doolally in her home for the bewildered, she announced to me that she was going to go to the travel agents and book a cruise. And I mean, she was just completely, there was just no way. So she chose another bewildered person at the home, and they went down to the travel agents and went in, and you can just imagine they didn't, it was just craziness. But she had this dream, and she used to sing faraway places with strange sounding names and things like that. And so that was just nice that, she came around the world with me on the boat. But the girls are all close to her as well. Bella, who's sitting over in the corner there, spent Nan's last night alive with her, holding her hand and telling her stories before she died. And so it was lovely. She's very much part of your life, isn't she? And always, like, Bella will carry her on always, and that's lovely. Yeah.
I'd love to start building the path of the broadcasting career, and there's so much to talk about. But when did you realise you had the gift of the gab? When did you start thinking radio or TV or broadcasting might be a future for you?
The first thing was theatre. So I thought, I looked around me in Bristol, and I thought the options are limited. Genuinely, the options are limited, and I saw them as limitless. But, in reality, they're a little bit limited here, and we've got no money. So I thought, that you can be rich, famous, or infamous, or a combination of them. The easiest one, I thought, would be famous. And I thought famous would be a way to become rich. And if you're rich, you can be infamous if you want to be. So you can have all three by being famous. I thought that was the way in. So I studied drama and won a scholarship to drama school, the only one that was given out in the west of England that year. And so went to drama school, whereupon I was greeted after day 3 at drama school by the equity rep. And it's highly unionized in Britain, highly unionized in many countries. And the equity rep said, what you all have to realize, and there was a class of about 8 of us, said what you all have to realize is it actually doesn't matter whether you're any good at this or not. If you do not know anyone in the industry, you will not succeed. This is the union with the highest number of unemployed members of any union in the world. So think long and hard before you waste another day in this school. And so at the same time, you've got your mother at home in this hideous bloody flat working in a plastic bag factory every hour God sent. And so I thought, okay, maybe this is a long bow. So where can I take the skill that I've got? And so I went to the local radio station, the BBC local radio station in Bristol. It was part of a network production centre. So some of their local radio stations are pretty much in houses on their own. But in places like London and Bristol and Birmingham and Manchester, they were part of network production centres. So it was like their local radio stations are very big. But what made it much bigger is that was also the natural history, that the natural history head office for the BBC. And obviously they had a big sports department there and multiple other things. So I just basically went there and said, look, I'll do anything at all. You don't need to pay me. I'll just do, So I started just running cables and things like that. And then they pay you a little bit for this, a little bit for that. And before you know it, you're an integral part of the British Broadcasting Corporation. And you look like a Bay City roller like I do on my little BBC tag, which Julian will be interested to know I haven't thrown out, along with the vacuum cleaners.
Okay, so link us back to New Zealand then, and I'm really interested in the Today FM stuff. Like you start a radio station, and then I'm not sure how many more years later you sell it. Like how old are you at this point, and what part of your journey are you on?
So I came back to New Zealand after working at the BBC and got a job with Radio New Zealand as a cadet, and went to Wellington. And there's no money. I think I earned $4,100 a year, and that was my weekly income was slightly less than the cost of the hotel that they'd put me in when they sent me down to Wellington as a cadet. And so, 1, I was overawed to have this job, but 2, I wasn't eating anything, and I couldn't leave because every minute I was there, I owed them slightly more than I had. So in the end, I went to HR, and I told them this is my conundrum, and so they put me on a sort of a tenure. And they said, well, we will pay your bill, but you have to leave immediately. And as long as you stay here for 2 years, we'll write off the debt. So I started working for national radio, what was then the national program, as a producer. And then did a bit of voicing and, went from one thing to another and gradually became hugely famous and the best broadcaster in New Zealand.
Well, we're going to get to that. But what about the starting your own thing?
So then there's a few years there doing different things, and then of course the spectrum was freed up in New Zealand. So New Zealand was extraordinarily regimented. There were a huge number of restrictions. I mean, we had the situation when I was down there as a cadet, where Muldoon announced the price and wage freeze. So literally, have you even heard of this?
Vaguely.
Cartoon. So literally, at night on television, you're watching the program on your black and white TV, and all of a sudden Muldoon's there, and he says, I am introducing, I think it was either 1 year or 2 year, wage and price freeze. No one will get an increase in wages. No one can put prices up by law. I mean, it was like a communist state, this country, like Carlist days, like the pandemic. But no, it was like a communist state. And then all of a sudden they freed up the spectrum. So something which was not within the reach of anyone. If you go back originally in New Zealand, the history of radio in New Zealand, which is a history that goes back to almost the beginning of radio in the world. So it started with private enterprise. And then all of a sudden, the government of the day, like, 1ZB, which is now News Talk ZB, that was a privately owned station which the government took over because it became very popular, and the government all of a sudden thought, well, hang on a second, these things shouldn't be in private hands, this is a bit too important for that, and they nationalised the whole thing. So a few dollars were given to the people that owned these businesses, and they became state-owned. So all of a sudden they freed up the spectrum, and I thought, right, I should buy a radio frequency, and successfully got one, which, it was a horrible process. Yeah. It was the second highest tender process, which should be illegal. I cannot believe that it isn't illegal. But the way that works is, so a bottle of my gin, so I put this gin up and I say you both want this gin, right? And so you bid for this gin. And you have to pay what the second highest bidder bids. So what that means is, if you really want it, you bid $2 million for it. And you hope that you just bid 50 cents. You win it because you've got the highest bid, but you only have to pay 50 cents. Yeah. But what that does, it encourages people, this is why they do it, it encourages people to make outrageous bids. Because you bid $2 million and you think, well, if I'm successful, I know I don't have to pay $2 million. But you've bid $1,800,000. Yeah. And that was how the system was run. It was changed a few years later. But it was a hugely offensive system. And what that meant was some people got really valuable licenses virtually for nothing, because it just happened that people didn't tender on those, or the people that did just, lazy tender. But other people paid just through the nose for, I think it was a 10-year. Anyway, I got a frequency in the Wairarapa, and it started Today FM.
Yeah. And so by the time you sold it, was that a good chunk of change? Like, was it a good business?
Did you get that $2 million when you sold it?
It was, got the $2 million and another $2 million. No, it was nowhere near that kind of money. But I did well. But the reason I had to sell it is that it wasn't feasible for me to run one single radio station, because I was up against, Radio New Zealand, which at that time owned, I don't know, I'm just pulling it out of the air, 80% of all the radio stations, and then small networks which were being established everywhere, like More FM. Doug Gold owned the More FM network, and it was really not feasible because of the cost of content. It was not really feasible just to own one radio station. I was working so many hours. So I sold it to someone that had a couple of other radio stations, and I did quite well. But a lot of people went out of business, went belly up, because they'd paid so much for the frequencies they couldn't possibly get the money back.
Yeah. So continuing the broadcasting journey, you sell the station, and then I'm linking you up to Breakfast in 2004.
Yeah.
But on the way up there, were you being targeted as the next big thing? You obviously went on to have this incredible career. But
but it was like a sort of potpourri of different jobs in broadcasting, because I don't have a consistent attention span. And so from there, I was doing network news reading. I quite like news reading because it's quite a good discipline. So I did network news reading for Radio New Zealand, and then I did some work for Radio Pacific. Then I got into Radio Pacific more and started doing more work for them, and so I was up in Auckland quite a lot doing that. Then I sold the idea of the foreign correspondent thing, got them as a contract and other contracts. So I was doing a lot of different things like that. When I stopped doing that, because I knew it was going to kill me, I knew that the only way out was to do something completely stupid, because I was taking more and more risks. I can remember I would arrive back in New Zealand having spent a couple of months in a war zone, and I would rent a car and drive down to the Wairarapa. So I'd get off this plane, travelling economy only, and cutting costs wherever I could. And I remember this one night, this just before I called it quits. I rented this Fiat sports car in Auckland, and I was just driving. I hadn't slept for God knows how long, and I was driving down, and I was just driving crazy fast, because once you've survived a few war zones and a few bombings, and you've had people hunting you down in the African bush, which I'd had, you don't imagine it's conceivable you'll be killed in a road crash in New Zealand. And I remember as my car sailed over the bank and was just free falling through the air, I remember thinking, this is cool. And when it crashed and a farmer picked me up, I thought, that is a message, that I'm not treating this seriously enough. And so I called the foreign correspondent stuff quits. Do you remember me arriving home in that smashed up car? Aside to Bella, you were very, very young. You were you were in a box. But yeah, it gets the better of you. And the people I was meeting, the other correspondents, that you'd see them and they'd gone, some of them completely feral.
We've had a number of breakfast TV hosts on the show, Jack Tame, Brodie Kane, and they've all spoken about the toll it takes over time, the early starts, the intensity of the 3 hours, all the bits and pieces going on. Was it hard for you? You did it for many years. When you reflect on that time, do you think...
Well, they're unnatural hours, and they do cost you life, because, human beings are not designed to get up when it's still dark and straight away be full on into it. And I was full on into it. I mean, I cared very deeply and still do about everything I did. It's like the gin, I mean, it matters to me that it is the best I can possibly make. It was the same with TV. It mattered to me very much. So I would get in and I would overly care about everything. And yeah, it takes its toll. It's unnatural. You get home at 10 o'clock and you are shattered, and you shouldn't be. Human beings shouldn't be shattered at 10 o'clock in the morning. And then sometimes I'd do radio in the afternoon or do close-up at night, when I used to do that on a Friday night. And so at the end of the week, you're completely shattered and you finish breakfast, ready just to coma out, but you know that you've got to be back in a couple of hours to do close-up. So it takes its toll. But at the same time, great job. I was, great job, worst hours.
I'm curious, when you started on breakfast, when you got the gig, one, did you have to audition or what was the process for that? But two, when you sat there for the first time or maybe after the first year, did you think, yeah, fuck, I've cracked it now. This is the one for me and I'm just going to go full throttle on this?
I never thought that I'd cracked it, And when I look back, breakfast has never had the ratings that it had when I was doing it with Pippa. That was the best of breakfast television in this country. And the ratings will never be, no matter what anyone does. If anyone comes along that's better than me, and I know what you're thinking, I'm thinking it too, it's not possible. But if anyone did, they still wouldn't get the ratings that we got. I mean, the media's moved on. There are so many bloody platforms now. So that was as good as it was ever going to get. But I was never entirely satisfied, and I was constantly wanting it to be better and do more.
That was going to be my question. Did you know that at the time, or were you constantly pushing boundaries?
I didn't. And you look back now, and it's so obvious. You just look at the way the viewership went. You look back at some of those programs. I mean, they were great. Breakfast television now is shit by comparison with what it was like then. I'm not just talking the viewership, but just the quality of the program. It's shite. And I don't know I don't entirely know why that is. And I watch it and I sometimes think, why is it this bad? Because clearly there is a huge resource going into it. Why is it this bad? I mean, you look at, and I don't want to talk about this much, but what do I care? You look at TVNZ Breakfast, right? What is it about that set? It's not a real set, right? It's computer-generated set. But for some reason, they want it to look like Changi Airport / the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Does anyone seriously want to get up and spend their morning in Changi Airport or the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? Does anyone seriously look at that and think, oh shit, someone climbed all the way up there to plant those plants? It's just, it should be about communication. And the very worst communication is creating something that's clearly bullshit.
Which is an interesting point, because when you shifted across to 3, how hands-on were you in terms of
100%
building that? Because everything from the microphones...
That was so cool.
Yeah.
That was so cool.
It changed the game.
It changed the game. And they're gradually pulling away. Well, they've completely pulled away from it now. But I remember late in the piece, they were down... it was such a struggle. And I remember one of the people who was head of the directors and that saying, we can't frame these microphones out. And I did my bloody nut. I said, seriously, you've come this far on the journey and you think I want to frame the microphones out? You think I want microphones 3 feet long so that we can frame them out? I mean, they just had no idea what I was after, But gradually they got it, I'm happy to see cameras move because it's part of the reality of it, And we're in this very fake environment, so at least let people be in it with us rather than paint this picture of some utopia in the middle of Auckland.
And 3 platforms simultaneously as well, which had never been done.
I know. It was, we bit off a lot, and, you never have enough money. But, I mean, the fact is you are never going to have enough money. In an industry like this, you can always spend more. Like, you could have 4 beers in front of you rather than 3. You could,
Yeah.
but there's only so much sponsorship. And so that was very much the case, at particularly TV3 at that time. I mean, they, hats off to them for everything they did. They had no money and no hopes of ever getting any.
Was there a little bit of, because the ratings followed you as well when you went across as well, was there a little bit of, fucking I told you so, to what you were doing?
No, because again, it never got to where I wanted it. And I'd come off air, and this used to happen at TVNZ as well, where you'd have a day where, shit went down, and, the reporters had to go out to something that wasn't planned, and there was a big story or something was happening, and you'd come off air at the end of the day, and everyone would just be complimenting each other, and people would be patting people on the back. Oh my God, that was amazing. And, it would take someone like me to say, actually, look at it back. It was nowhere near what it should have been. Just because you weren't expecting to have to get a car out of the carpool and drive to Taupo, doesn't make it great TV, And so I was constantly, maybe I went too far sometimes, but I was constantly disappointed.
Yeah, controversies make great TV, right? The ratings follow, and I imagine you are encouraged in that job to be you, who is outspoken and unpredictable, and you've got opinions on things. And there's a line, and I guess the bosses want you to get right up to that line but not cross it. And sometimes you cross it, and that comes with the package, right? That's why your numbers were so incredible, because people would tune in. Some would tune in to love you, some would tune in to hate you, some would tune in just to see what you got to say.
And a lot of the people that hate you, they tune in to have their prejudices about you reinforced. Well, that's fine.
So we're thinking about, I mean, there are a list of controversies. When you think back at them, do you reflect on them? Do you think they were mistakes? Was that part and parcel of the job? How do you dwell on that?
Well, it was
now?
definitely part and parcel of the job, in that I was employed just to be me, and it was the way I was. And were they mistakes? I mean, there are a couple of things that I did that better judgment would say don't do, but I wasn't prejudging what I did. I was just doing it. And that was the beauty. It's the beauty of me, really. I mean, I've given no thought to this interview at all. And people would say to me, do you get nervous before you go on? You get nervous before you do something if you think too much about it, because if you don't do it the way you've thought about it, you think it's fucking up. But if you don't think about it, if you just say, look, they've employed me to be me, so I'll go in and be me. And the day they stop employing me will be the day they don't want me anymore for whatever reason. But I never want to be employed because I'm not me. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and people will talk about the famous things I allegedly did wrong, or the controversies and that, and they will ignore the fact that I was doing 3 hours live television 5 days a week for 7 years. If you have 3 hours worth of conversation with your partner 5 days a week for 7 years, you're going to say some things that you possibly shouldn't have,
Yeah.
And so you've got to sort of, the beauty of being with someone who isn't guarded, who's just seeing something for the first time, and that used to happen to me quite often. I'd see something, and I think people at home have seen that too, and I'd say, hang on a second, just can you play that back again? What's happening in the background there? And then you'd laugh about it. You've seen it, none of it's pre-planned, And that was the beauty of it. So sometimes there was someone doing something they're not supposed to do there, and you've highlighted it. And you started to laugh at it and then saw what they were doing. Oh, shit.
Yeah.
But you're in, you're out,
Well, yeah, it did appear manic at times, like you say. It's unnatural to be that intense and that tuned in and that sleep deprived for so long.
Yeah.
The dick shit one springs to mind, and it's like, from what I understand, that was the way you pronounced it.
That was her name.
Dick
Yeah.
shit. You were told to pronounce it differently.
Yeah.
You went with the real name.
The
You
official
laughed at it,
pronunciation was
and
Dixit.
and it became an international.
Well, but did it? Some absolute twat working for Foreign Affairs in India apologised. And I know this for a fact. When they apologised, no one knew what they were talking about. So this apology, which was not solicited, they didn't know anything about it, was offered without authorisation from New Zealand by this Foreign Affairs person in India. And all of a sudden it becomes an incident. The funny thing is I received quite a few emails, one way or another they got to me through TVNZ, from students of Sheila Dixit's who said, she actively laughed about her own name because she was a minister of the Crown in India, but also was a lecturer at university. And she said, and she she credited her success in life to her surname that people laughed about.
Yeah.
You know? But, I mean, God, I could not do now the sort of jobs I've done in the past because New Zealand has become so prissy and so specific and I hate that term politically correct, but there's an element of truth in it. And I hate the term woke, but there's an element of truth in it. You know, I just wouldn't bow down to that now because at the end of the day, we talked about it before, it comes down to communication. You know, I'm just a bloke and I'm just seeing it as, you know, telling it as I see it.
Did it matter to you? You've just said what Dick Shit's response was. Did it matter to you how they took it in these controversies, like the moustache on the women?
That's a good example because I was led to believe, although I never heard this firsthand, that she was upset about it. And of course, I'd never intended to upset anyone, you know, and I don't intend to upset anyone. So yes, I'm sorry that someone was upset by it, but am I sorry for actually doing it? I mean, you can't be sorry for doing it in hindsight because you didn't have all that information up front because that's what hindsight is. You know, in exactly that situation again, would I have done it? Yes. Would I do it again in exactly that situation again? Yes, I would. And people say, oh, but look, she was so, but you don't know these things going in. And you can avoid saying anything that may vaguely upset anyone, but then what you're doing is avoiding saying anything at all. You know, and you're just becoming another script reader.
Is it a frustration that those handful of incidents kind of characterise your time in the spotlight in New Zealand? When you consider, like you said, 5 days a week, 3 hours a morning, over 7 years, that's a shitload of TV.
Shitload.
But those situations seem to repeatedly pop up.
People bring them up all the time. But I suppose in a sense they are the highlights. Some people would say the lowlights, but they're the highlights of a career because they were hugely publicised. Like my sacking, I was the biggest racist in this country, right? That was my sacking was framed, you know, biggest racist in the country. And I literally had to go and hide out. Like there were journalists staking out my mother's rest home, you know, in case I went there, staking out my girlfriend's house, you know, literally camped in my driveway. So, I mean, that's how big a racist I was that I required that kind of scrutiny. My private life required that kind of scrutiny. But it's all, it's part of the rich tapestry.
I think listening back to your earlier stories, that and during the research, I clocked I think you were going to like a conference in Sky City, and there was like a demonstration at the front, quite heated. I think someone spat at you.
Yeah, that wasn't even that long ago.
Yeah.
They were demonstrating at the National Party conference, which was being held in there. And I was going there for, someone had auctioned lunch with me as a charity lunch. So I had given up my precious time because I'm so bloody wholesome to go and have lunch with strangers who were paying money to a charity. But I suppose because I was just evil. You know, I represented the evil, corporate, wealthy arseholes running this country.
But was that a regular kind of occurrence to have those every day?
That was an extreme.
Right. But toned down those sorts of situations in public?
Not much. And the number of people that would just come up to me and say the loveliest things, you know. I think a lot of people are frightened of saying the wrong, you know. People are more likely to say nothing at all, but certainly more likely to say something nice and want a photograph or something like that than they are to come up and attack you on something. I remember I was leaving a restaurant once, and I was in a restaurant once and someone got up and walked out and said, I'm not going to sit in here with this racist. They didn't say it to me, they said it as they walked past. I said, excuse me, if you want to talk to me about anything, you're welcome to talk. Of course, then they ran. You know, I mean, I'm not a racist, but I'm not interested in saying that. Do you know what I mean? But there is nothing that's happened to me that makes me even remotely interested in trying to prove that I'm not.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I feel like you're the kind of guy that if the abuse and the vitriol is coming to you, fine, whatever, you'll deal with it. But as soon as the family start getting involved, does that cross the line? Like, are you active?
That's what bothered me about, like, particularly, you know, my mother and things like that. Yeah, because that's totally unfair. And, you know, mostly criticism is water off a duck's back to me, as you say. The thing that I don't like is when someone criticizes me based on something that isn't true. So if they believe something about me themselves that isn't true, I'm okay with that, but I'm not okay with them saying, oh, he's this because of this. And if that thing isn't a thing, then that slightly annoys me, maybe slightly frustrates me. But mostly I'm not subjected to it anyway. And it doesn't really happen now because I'm just a retiree, making and consuming gin.
Commercial whaling, is that part of the highlights package with Guy Williams, or is that something that you don't even lend any more
I'll be honest with you, I can barely remember it. I remember it, but I can barely remember what happened around it. But again, what I would say there, one, I would say good on him for getting on air with it. But I think that is an indication of what you were saying before about, 3 hours of television, 5 days a week. It's a hungry beast, and it is hard to cobble together enough food for that. And so the opportunity for someone with some rogue intent to get on air is actually quite high.
Yeah, for those who don't know what we're talking about, Guy Williams, at the very start of his career, I think, got on and pretended to be a commercial whaler in support of commercial whaling, right? And it was this sort of 3-4 minute slot, and he's very straight faced. And you were kind of, it seemed like you were kind of
because they didn't say that when it was being set up. Right. Obviously, it wasn't set up that way. But of course, I didn't set interviews up. And so I'd come in and I'd get notes on something, and you'd inquire about it, but it's 4 a.m. and none of the people there know. They've just handed you the note.
Oh, this is interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and you say, well, can you just ask so-and-so a few things in the green room? Yeah, but no one's ever got time to do that. And so those things were going to creep in. It was a good thing that it happened, actually, because I think it showed TVNZ that maybe they need to, run a ruler over some things.
You said you might not remember, but it must have been minutes afterwards. People were like, was that guy for real?
Yeah.
He's full of shit, right? And then the penny must have dropped. Yeah. I was like, oh, fuck.
It's hard to remember. I can't even remember what year that was.
I feel like you can almost see in your face the moment that you go, this can't be.
Yeah.
This can't be legit.
And
this
you think, God, but then part of you thinks, he's actually sitting here on the couch with me. So there's got to be, there's got to be something in it. It's not like just any old fool can get in on the couch, but then it turned out any old fool could. And he taught us that.
I think it'll be better for the whales in the long run was the line that got me.
So you're at the other side, the broadcasting. I mean, you're young. You've got lots of years left. Are you done with it? Are you retired?
I'm semi-retired. I sort of was happy to be completely retired, and then COVID sort of changed my plans. I spent quite a bit of time out of the country. But COVID, I was only prepared to do one managed isolation a year because I figure 2 weeks a year is okay, but 4 weeks is ludicrous. So I did one a year, which meant when I went overseas, I had to stay for longer periods of time and do my traveling from one country to another rather than coming back here. And I ended up, being told, like so many people, you guys probably weren't told that you were non-essential, but I've never considered myself to be non-essential. But I was specifically told by the government of the day that I was non-essential, so I thought, shit, I've got to do something about that. So I got the TV job so that I could be essential again, and drive around and look out the window at non-essential people cowering in their homes. And so I sort of started to get into a little bit of work, and I've got a couple of things on now. But I mean, fundamentally, I'm retired. My boat's still in New Zealand. It's been here. I keep getting extensions on the import license for it, but it's got to be out by the end of June next year. But they give me extensions because of COVID, but I won't get any more now. So I'll be able to go back to my normal life. But I have picked up a little bit of, there's a couple of things. But when you say I'm young, am I really?
Well, were you 61? 62?
62. I was young when I was 61.
Well played, Steve. Well played.
No, but you
got some good years left.
I hope so. But I don't want to spend them working. No. You look at a lot of people that, and some people live to work, but I don't want to do that.
62, Paul. Is it true? Is there any truth to the fact that you never changed a nappy before the age of 60?
Yeah.
How did you dodge that ball?
I would have been quite happy to end my days having never changed a nappy. That's my little grandson, Rayhan, little arsehole. And there was a 2-hour window where I was in sole charge, and I sat him down on the carpet.
Have these crackers.
I said to him,
have this dry toast.
I didn't think, because I never think things through. So he was eating yogurt Probably not ideal.
No.
But I sat him down and I
Dates.
said, look, you and me are going to do this together. And then I looked at his face and I thought, you little shit. And
You must have had a general idea.
well, all the stuff was left by Lucy, his mother, but I didn't pay any attention. Oh, so what you do if you need to, yeah. And there was bags and like ropes, not ropes, but, paraphernalia.
There was an opportunity for you to maybe walk in your father's footsteps and say, all right, well, you sort this out yourself.
Do you know what I did? There was a paddling pool in the garden. It was
Yes.
freezing cold. There was a paddling pool in the garden, and I took him out of his old nappy and just threw him in the paddling pool.
Yeah. Has that story ever heard the light of day?
It
or-
was like soup when his mother came home. He was writhing around in bisque.
It's very, very graphic. Very, very graphic.
Oh,
Amazing. So Palm Springs
Yeah,
plays,
speaking of pools.
Speaking of pools, Palm Springs plays a big part of your life. Now, what percentage of your year are you over there?
Oh, it varies, but when I've owned a place there for a long, long time, and I thought it's only worth buying it if I'm going to be a minimum 3 months a year there. And since I've had it, which is maybe getting on for 10 years now, I've averaged at least 3 months a year. So some years it's more, some years very, very slightly less.
And what percentage of that time are you in the nude?
Well, a greater percentage than most people are in the nude. Because obviously I don't stay in the house all the time, or in the area where the house is, which is a nudist encampment.
Right.
So when I travel around Palm Springs, and I go on a lot of road trips there, I wear clothes because you get into a lot of trouble. If you want to be at the wrong end of a taser, take your clothes off on an interstate. But it is. It's a nudist. It's a nudist housing area. So
There's a lot of mail around at the moment on getting sun on your testicles or on your perineum.
oh.
You've not heard
No.
any of that, or you don't
No.
subscribe to that
Well,
theory?
we nudists don't. Well, I didn't even know it was a theory to subscribe to. But if you're a nudist, you don't read that kind of thing, or maybe you should. What does it say? He says in an alarmed face.
It says poke your perineum directly at the sun for, I think, 15 minutes a day.
Is it?
Yeah, health benefits.
Seems like quite a lot.
Oh, so it's a positive thing.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
I don't imagine
thought you were
it
gonna tell
be
me-
a negative thing.
Well, I would have thought, because I must admit, I have, on occasion, I have thought it would be particularly easy to be irradiated in that area, wouldn't it?
Well, that's my rudimentary understanding of that skin in particular.
Although what you're saying is it's a good thing to be irradiated. in that
Again,
area.
you're putting words in my mouth. I've heard this.
Right.
But the theory goes that...
Well, I'm not really putting words in your mouth. That's exactly what you just said.
Yeah, you did say that. Yeah, I did say that. You're right. The theory goes a lion and a gorilla doesn't hide its testicles, so why should a man?
Very hard to argue with that.
Use that information as you choose.
Should have said that in more Sadoom sort of a way.
Sardoon.
We don't.
Is it in?
We're getting near the end. We don't need to spend too much time on it. But what is it about the nudist?
I can't tell you. I can't tell you because you won't understand.
I don't know, Stephen. There's a lot of nudity at Stephen's
a lot
house.
Of nudity. I've got
A
3
lot
young
of
children.
In which case you will
and
understand.
There's a lot of nudity at our house.
When you
I've stopped going around.
when
there.
you realise that clothes they're just an impediment, and you just swim naked and you just walk around naked and it's just I don't even want to use the word liberating, but it just is an enhancement to the enjoyment of your life.
You'd subscribe to that, wouldn't you? See,
What about sports? You can't play tennis nude.
Okay, so here's the thing.
volleyball. I heard.
I'm not a naturist, which is nudism is almost a religion to naturists. Like they go to the door, if they go to the door and open the door and there's UPS drivers there and you're naked and everything. I mean, that's unnecessary. And going hiking, people, these naturists, they go hiking in the desert naked. That's ludicrous. It's dangerous. Like, there's a lot of cacti. It's just silly. I mean, there's a whole reason to have clothes. So I'm not religious about it. But if it's swimming, if it's sunbathing, if it's just walking around the garden or around the complex or, having a wine in the sun, it's just lovely.
Did you have to stop doing it in Remururoa?
No. Now, I had a complaint from one of the neighbours, but they had to go to extreme lengths to see me naked swimming in the pool. What they should have really complained about is almost slipping off the kitchen sink where they had to stand to see me through the hedge,
It's amazing what people do to get outraged.
It is just amazing. People hunt outrage out. Yeah, they definitely do.
I feel like we've there's so much to your life. There's 3 books. We've barely scratched the surface, but hopefully we've painted a bit of a picture. But I want a couple of big questions to finish. Like, you know, you've lived this life. You do have some good years left. What motivates you now? What is it? What's it all about? What's the rest of your life going to be?
Well, one of the things is obviously my children. So spending time with them and being interested in what they're going to do and helping them do things is a big motivator. Deciding where I'm going to live is a motivator. You have to be very careful that you don't waste too much time waiting to live. And most people, in fact, I think everybody to a degree is wasting their life waiting to live. You know, everyone will tell you that, oh yeah, they're going to do that as soon as they've done this. So they're waiting to do the thing they really want to do because they've got to make more money, or they've got to finish their job, or they've got to do this around the house, or they've got to have kids, or they've got to wait for the kids to finish school or leave the house, or there's always a reason that people are waiting to do the thing they're telling you that they're going to do and they're going to enjoy. And most people push that forward and forward and forward until after they die, when it's obviously too late. So I don't want to, I'm not as guilty of that as most people are, but I'm still a bit guilty of it. So I've got to decide, where do I want to live? Do I want to spend the rest of my life in New Zealand? And I probably don't.
Was there a moment when you decided to stop waiting to live?
Yes, but I didn't stop waiting to live at that moment. So yes, there was a moment that I thought enough is enough several years ago.
What was that?
Well, it wasn't really a catalyst. It was part of it was the boat. You know, building a boat, traveling around the world. Well, you have to be moderately fit to do that, and it turns out it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. But still, you do it. You know, and to know it's not all it's cracked up to be, you've got to do it. And I'm glad I did it, and it was amazing. But you think, you know, I could just wait until, you know, well, maybe I could have a bigger boat if I earned more money, and then you have the other thing, particularly for me, where I was earning a phenomenal amount of money, but that was when I wanted to not work anymore. And you think, you know, I've waited until this point. These people are saying, well, you just name your price and do one more year. And I can remember saying to someone who said that to me, I said, I have 13 good summers left. And you're wanting to buy one of those from me. How much should I charge you for it? You know, and they said, oh God, you're still young. What do you mean 13? I said, good summers. I said, I can pretty much guarantee the way things have gone that I will still be fit enough to enjoy 13 more summers. And I just can't afford to sell you one, you know. But you just decide how many summers are you prepared to part with, you know.
Are you at a point where money is no longer important? You've got enough to last you 50 summers, you know, so there is no number.
Yeah. I mean, the trouble is you've got to be very careful that you don't just start working for money. Now, what I mean by that is not working to get money. I mean working to get money for your money, you know? So when have you got enough? Could I have more money? Yes. Would I like more money? Yes. I'm not sure why. I'm literally not sure why. But yes, I would like more money. Would like twice as much money as I've got? Yes, very much. But would it change my life? No. You know, so why do I even, you know? So you do have to, some of the happiest people, in fact, I don't know that any of the richest people are the happiest people. I don't know that there is, I don't know. Of all the really rich people I know people that are quite content and that are happy being rich, but the people I know that are the happiest are nowhere near the richest people I know, you know? And this is not like some gospel according to me or anything like that. It's just what I've noticed. So why do I don't work for money.
Are you happy now?
Yeah. You know, I'm not content, and true happiness comes from contentment. And I'm not content. I'm not entirely sure that I ever will be, but I'm happy. I am happy. Sometimes you're happier than other times.
How do you consume your media now? Do you?
Yeah, I do. I suppose the internet. I suppose mostly the internet. I read now for the joy of reading. I do not read for work anymore, so I actually read books now. And for decades and decades, I didn't read books because I was having to read so much to continue to be informed. And now I just read for the joy of reading. You know, I used to, I don't know if do you guys read much?
Yeah, I was going to ask for some recommendations afterwards.
Oh.
Or during.
Okay, so singly one of the best books I've ever read in my life is We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. It's just a small book, 160 pages or something, absolutely brilliant. Takes you on a journey that you don't even know you're on. We Were Liars, E. Lockhart. But I used to look at people, I'd be in airports and that, and you'd look at people reading and you'd think, how can you even do that? One page after another, just trolling through that bloody book, carrying it around to God knows where. And here you are in this amazing place and you're reading that bloody book that you could read anywhere. But now I get it, I know what it's like to actually get, engrossed in a book.
Paul, I've really enjoyed this chat. It's been really fun.
Yeah.
And I've learned so much about you, and there's so many great stories to tell. Everything I had read about you or heard you say prior to this was that you didn't enjoy interviews and you really didn't like doing it. And I'm kind of curious, how come you've come on our podcast?
The worst, well, partly it was to promote the gin.
What's it called?
It's called, thank you for asking. It's called The Henry. And the best place to get it is just go on the Instagram, The Henry Spirit, and there's a link there, or go on the website, or, but anyway, if people are really interested, they'll find it. Most people are not really interested enough. They just go in and buy the gin that they've always bought. This is brilliant gin. What was the question?
Coming on the podcast, like talking to us, has it been all right?
Yeah,
has it not been too painful?
No, it's actually been great because it's long form, which is quite nice because it's not so incredibly once over lightly. And, you do fundamentally get bored saying the same things. Someone will ask you a question and you've lost the will to live before they've finished asking the question. Do you know what I mean?
We'll edit those ones out.
I wrote an article about the Scott Watson thing in the Herald a couple of days ago, and some journalists phoned up and started asking me questions, and I thought, you phoned me up because I wrote an article that you clearly haven't read. So someone said to you, oh, this is interesting, phone them up and find out if there's anything else. So they did that without reading the thing that apparently was interesting. You just lose the will to live. I can remember once an author in the early days, I used to say to my producers, I don't want to speak to any authors just because they brought a book out. The rule should be, if that person is interesting enough to talk to, irrespective of whether they brought a book out, we will talk to them and we can promote their book. But I don't want to talk to them just because. And you talk to it. Anyway, I remember talking to this author once, and he said, "Have you read my book?" And I said, "No, I haven't read the book. But you're not here because of this book that I'm holding in my hand." And I said, "If I had read the book, what benefit would that be to you?" And he said, "Well, you'd know what to ask." And I said, "Well, no." I said, "I wouldn't. I wouldn't ask you what you should be asked if I read the book." I said, "You're selling a book to people that haven't read it." I said, "If the person who's helping you sell it has read it, I won't ask you any of the right questions." Yeah. Anyway, satisfactorily confounded this person. But with interviews, I like something like this where it's just genuinely fun. It's just genuinely interesting talking. And you're clearly a little bit interested in what I'm saying. Most interviewers are not really interested in what the person's saying, sadly.
It's been incredibly interesting. Shay is our outro guy. He might have a few bits and pieces, but I'll pass over to the big guy.
I'm going to ask you, did you genuinely subscribe to I've said subscribe so many fucking times today.
It's quite a good word, though.
Yeah, but fuck, I've caught myself subscribing to everything today.
Don't beat yourself up, bro.
No,
you're doing good, man.
You're dealing with, broadcast royalty here. I want to get it right. 3 questions?
Yes.
Is that what you prepared when you were preparing to speak to someone? Did you only have 3 questions?
I mean, occasionally it was more, but fundamentally 3 questions framed the interview. And you see, if you've only got 3 questions going in, then you really have to listen to the answers because 3 questions won't last. But if the answers to your 3 questions don't spontaneously elicit a conversation that's interesting, then you're hopeless. Then you shouldn't be asking questions at all. I mean, all you want is a rough framework. That was my thing. You go in there with a rough framework. You don't go in there with some pre-prescribed plan to get someone to say a particular thing, because you will just miss all these clues that you're constantly given, and you'll miss the opportunity to find out things that are new. I mean, so many interviews now are conducted by people who are they're not trying to find anything out. They are trying to get someone to say a particular thing. And my argument was always, it's not the interviewer's job to question the answers that anyone gives. It's just the interviewer's job to make someone answer the questions. And it really frustrates me, but it's the audience's job to question the answers, the interviewer's job to ask the questions and make sure they answer them. So the only times I used to get really annoyed with interviewees, and obviously it's almost always politicians, is when they won't answer the questions. You can't get annoyed with their answer if you don't like it, because they've done what you've asked them to do. They've answered the question.
Right, outro, is it?
Yeah, outro time. I'll just do my little one. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
No, I've really enjoyed it.
It's been fantastic. Buy the gin. I'd love to try it sometime.
Is it? Well, you can have the rest of this. I've only had a tiny sip because I'm driving.
Oh
my
yeah,
God, have you seen how many cops are on the road now?
Yeah.
Just like over this summer. It's like they're really focusing on it. It's a shame they can't fix the roads.
That was what I was angling at, so I'm glad you've picked up on that cue.
I'm sorry it's an opened one.
Henry, that's fine. I'll take it. But Shay's our outro guy. Shay, line it up, buddy.
I got a little bit emotional last night when I was reflecting on your relationship with your mum. As I mentioned earlier, I'm super close to my mum. As we've spoken today, there's another element to it as well, which is my dad passed away 12 years ago. And one of the things I love about this medium, and you've spoken about your love for your kids and presumably for your grandkids as well, is that we get to capture these moments that will live on forever. And I miss my dad's storytelling. And I know Bella's in the corner there, and she's been privy to this. Probably, I don't know how many times she would have heard a lot of these stories before. But fuck, what I wouldn't give to be able to hear my dad's voice tell one of those stories that I never wish at the time that I would hear again.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm really, really... Yeah, it's one of the things that makes me
But it's your
most
job
proud.
now to pass those stories on.
Yeah, totally.
And which, of course, you'll do. And I mean, I'm lucky that my girls remember to a degree my father. He's been dead a long time. And certainly remember my mother and some of her stories. But, you think about the extraordinary lives they led. And my mother, who was just so, dirt poor when she was young. I mean, going through the Second World War, and it was a nightmare for her. And it does, when they're gone, you think, shit, I should have just listened to the stories more. I should be able to retell those stories. But, you're just tired and they start to speak and you think, oh, God,
Yeah.
is that the time?
Yeah, yeah.
Can't you stay a bit longer? No, but I'll stay longer next time. Just say that to my mother all the time, She'd say that, oh, could you just stay a little bit? No. I used to go in to visit my mother, who I love just so, so dearly. And I used to go in with the exit line. She'd say, oh, it's so good to see you, Paul. Can't stay long. And you're counting down. You practice. Sometimes you don't even sit down, And, now, of course, you'd wish just to have one more visit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the detail that you add to something like a photo of a Fanta expired from 2006 that will live on forever now that we've captured it in this little bottle. So
thank you. Really,
really happy with that. Yeah. And I really want to see you back and doing something out in the public eye.
I've got a couple of little things on. One quite big thing in New Zealand a little bit later in the year, which I've said yes to and immediately regretted it when I did. But it's new and it's a bit different, so it's a bit interesting. We'll see how it goes.
Well, I wish you all the best with that,
Thank
I
you.
wish you all the best with the Henry as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you both very much.
Cheers, Paul.
Loved it.